This is a photograph of my grandfather, Dr. Luther Leonidas Hill, whom I called as a child and all my life Dampa, D-A-M-P-A. He was a surgeon in Montgomery and studied under Lord Joseph Lister in Scotland. There'll be a couple of interesting stories about him on this DVD. This is a picture of my grandmother, Dr. Hill's wife, Lily Lyons Hill, or really Lillian Lyons Hill. She was from Mobile, Alabama. She was Jewish, but her family at some point, I don't know when, converted to Catholicism. This is a photograph of President John F. Kennedy signing a bill that my father got through the Senate. The man on the far right is Congressman Boykin from Mobile, Alabama. He co-sponsored it in the House. Next to Mr. Boykin is my father. Next to my father is John Sparkman. And next to him is Adlai Stevenson. This is a photograph of my grandmother, Dr. Hill's wife, Lillian Lyons from Mobile, Alabama. This was taken there when she was a child. I called her Nana, N-A-N-A. That was my nickname for her. This is a photograph of my father holding a straw hat. To his left is his father, my grandfather, Dr. Hill. To Dr. Hill's left is my great uncle, Will Hill. William Wallace Hill was his full name. They were very close, those three. I cannot identify the person on the far left. Uncle Will, William Wallace Hill, was my grandfather's brother. The one in the middle is my grandfather, Dr. Hill, in the dark jacket. This is a photograph of my father on the far left with Charles and my two sons, Charles Clark Hubbard Jr. in the middle, and to his left on the far right is his little brother, Joseph Lister Hill, named for my father. This is a photograph of my father on the far right. Next to him is my mother, Henrietta Fontaine McCormick Hill. Next to her is my brother, Luther Lister Hill, and his wife, Catherine Gore Hill. This is a photograph of my grandmother, Lillian Lyons Hill, obviously in her wedding dress. This is a photograph of Admiral Nimitz signing the peace agreement with the Japanese on the USS Missouri. This is the day the Japanese surrendered. It's inscribed to my father, to Senator Lister Hill, with best wishes and great esteem, and it's signed Admiral Nimitz, Fleet Admiral of the U.S. Navy. In the foreground of this picture, which you may not be able to recognize, on the far left is General Douglas MacArthur. This is a second photograph of Admiral Nimitz signing the peace agreement with the Japanese. This is a photograph of President Franklin D. Roosevelt that he sent to my father, and he inscribed it to Lister Hill from his friend Franklin Roosevelt. My father nominated him for the unprecedented third term and he was elected president for the third term. And there is a separate DVD on my father that has a photograph of him making the nomination. He also came to Montgomery to help my father in his campaigns. This is a photograph of my father on the far right talking to Vice President Alvin Barkley in the middle, and Senator Kerr on the far left from Oklahoma. And the inscription on this photograph reads, "To my great friend Lister Hill, with deep affection." This is a photograph of my mother and father with Representative Boykin from Mobile. My father's on the far right, my mother's in the middle, and Boykin is on the far left. This is a photograph of my father and mother. My mother's on the far right. Next to her is Vice President Barkley, then my father, and then Mrs. Barkley. They were great friends. The two couples were good friends. This is a photograph of my father with some of his colleagues and friends. On the far right is Robert McNamara, my father, Senator John Sparkman, and Kenneth Roberts, who I think was a congressman. Mr. McNamara was Secretary of Defense under President Kennedy and President Johnson. This is a photograph of my father, Lester Hill, giving a speech. He often used his hands for emphasis, but not like Harry Truman. This is a photograph of my father on the far right, some person in the Air Force next to him, Governor Big Jim Folsom in the middle, and I'll tell you a story about him in a minute. And then the next person to the left was the commandant of Maxwell Field, and I cannot tell you who the man in the civilian suit on the far left is. When I got married, the night Charles and I married, November 25th, 1950, it went down to 12 degrees, which was rather chilly. And I was standing in the foyer at the back of the church just with my wedding dress on, waiting to go down the aisle. And the door, the outside door, opened, and this great blast of cold air hit me, and I said, "Who opened that door?" And I looked around, and there was Big Jim Folsom. He was quite a character, and also was known as Kissin' Jim Folsom. This is a photograph of my father on the left, talking to Senator Barry Goldwater on the right. Although my father didn't agree with Barry Goldwater, he held him in great respect. This is my father on the left, and I think on the far right is Senator Mansfield. Obviously, he's with some of his colleagues discussing a bill. All right, this is President Johnson at his inaugural ball with his wife Lady Bird and Hubert Humphrey. This is a photograph of President Lyndon Johnson, and on the bottom he has written, "To Lester Hill with regards of his friend Lyndon Johnson." This is a photograph of Lyndon Johnson signing one of my father's bills that he got passed through the Senate. That's my father on the far left. This is a photograph of my grandfather, Dr. Luther Leonidas Hill, that I've mentioned to you before, that my pet name for him was Dampa, D-A-M-P-A. This is a photograph of my father, again making a speech, and you see how he uses his hands. He might have been saying, "Give 'em hell, Harry," because that's what he used to say when people jumped on Harry Truman. This is a photograph of my father and me when I was a very young child. This is a photograph that was taken at my grandparents', I think it was their 60th anniversary. In the picture, starting from the right rear, in the back is my father going from right to left. Then his sister, Emily Hill Lastly, and then Dr. E.W. Rucker, my aunt Lillian Rucker, who's next in the line, her husband. Next to him is young L.L. Hill, and next to him is Dr. Carney Lastly, and next to him is Luther Lyons Hill, my father's brother. Seated on the sofa starting at the right is my mother, then the picture of me, and then my grandfather Dampa and my grandmother Nana. These are all Hills. I said it was my grandparents' 60th anniversary, but I think I'm wrong. It was probably their 50th anniversary. This is a photograph of William Wallace Hill, my great grandfather.
You can say any of that in there you want to say.
He was born in North Carolina in 1788, son of Colonel William Hill and Velvy Wallace Hill, Veley, Wallace Hill. He married Nancy Bowen, daughter of Quaker minister Thomas Bowen, and he became a minister in the Methodist Protestant Church in 1828. He moved to Greensboro, Alabama in 1835 and became a wealthy planter. This is the Reverend Luther Leonidas Hill, son of William Wallace and Nancy. The Reverend L.L. was born in Hyde County, North Carolina in 1823. His name suggests staunch defense. Leonidas, of dissent and reform, Luther, wrote he thinking of his father. He knew at least the power of a name, and that is more than many people know. He moved to Alabama with his family, married twice, always heeding his own advice, married for love, but remember it is just as easy to fall in love with a rich girl as a poor one. And this is something that my maternal grandmother always told me too.
Okay.
He married a woman that had a lot of money. That was his first wife. And when she died, he sent to Italy and got the finest marble and has quite a monument that's at the old Oakwood Cemetery of Mary and her little lambs. He was out riding the circuit as a Methodist minister, and when he came home, they had all died of a fever. And only one child was left, and that was Walton Hill, who was the half-brother to my grandfather. This is Laura Sarah Croom. In February 1861, the Reverend L.L. married. His bride, Laura Sarah Croom, was 17 years his junior. Laura was born in Greensboro, Alabama on December the 9th, 1840, the 12th child of Wiley Jones Croom and Elizabeth Holliday. At age 9, she became an orphan. She was raised by her sister, Eliza Turnstall, and was educated in Baltimore and New York. She, like Mary Helena, was rich. They were both rich. Both the wives were rich. She would become the mother of my grandfather and all of his siblings, the Hill boys and the 2 Hill girls, with the exception of his half-brother, Walton, who was from his first marriage. This is a photograph of the Montgomery home of the Reverend L.L. Hill after the war. Reverend L.L. saw no service in the Confederate Army. Quote, "If I am too deaf to give orders, I am too deaf to receive them," he was reported to have said. He still owned Rosemary, that's the name of this plantation where he lived, but since his church was in Montgomery, he and his family lived there in the house pictured. The 2 ladies in front by the tree may be his daughters. The property that he owned is now, it stayed in the family until fairly recent history. It's on the corner of Perry Hill, that would be the northwest corner of Perry Hill Road and the Vaughn Road. Rosemary was spelled Rosemerry. This is a photograph of the Hill family. 8 of Laura's children, who was the second wife of L.L. Hill, they all managed to live. In the back row are pictures of the Reverend L.L. Hill and Walton Wadsworth, the surviving child of his first wife, Mary. Back row, Dr. Thomas Bowen Hill, Bessie Hill, Laura Hill, and William Wallace Hill. Front row, the Reverend Eugene Lott, Dr. R.S. Hill, Dr. L.L., and Wiley Croom. For years, the brothers met each Sunday for dinner to decide what the Hill position was on any issue. In this photograph, taken some years later, this is the Hill brothers having their weekly Sunday meeting and dinner. On the far left is my great uncle, William Wallace Hill. Next to him, Thomas Bowen Hill. Next to him, in the middle, Robert Somerville Hill. Next to him, Wiley Croom Hill. And on the far right, my grandfather, Dr. Luther Leanders Hill. This is a photograph of my grandfather, whom I call Damper, when he was a little boy. He was the second Luther Leanders Hill. As a young boy, the Reverend L.L. and Laura's son was born in 1860. He remembered the occupation of Montgomery by Wilson's raiders when he was dressed in a coat in which was hidden some of the gold his father had saved during the war. His father, Reverend L.L., buried the family silver in the Rose Garden to save it from the Yankee raiders. Dr. L.L. quoted his father as having said he never before had worked so hard, which is probably true. This is a photograph of my grandfather, Dr. L.L. Hill's family. On July 12, 1888, Dr. L.L. married Lily Lyons of Mobile. Here she is pictured with their 4 surviving children. The oldest boy, another Luther Leanders, died as a baby. The children are left to right, Emily, whose nickname was Baby, Luther Lyons, Joseph Lister, and Lillian, who was known as Rucky. Emily and Joseph Lister were twins. Dr. L.L. followed Reverend L.L.'s advice and example. Lily was rich, her father having been a leading Mobile capitalist after the war. This photograph shows my father's twin sister, Emily, with the family dog named Sport. And I know my father was very fond of that dog and spent a lot of time with him. He always loved dogs. This is a picture of my father's sister, Lillian, and she went by the nickname of Rucky because she was married to Dr. E.W. Rucker of Birmingham, lived there. This is a picture of my father's brother, Luther Lyons Hill, really known as LL, as a young boy. He attended the University of Alabama and then went to West Point and was a general during World War II.
Going from left
to right. Joseph Lister Hill, his sister, Lillian Lyons Hill, better known as Rucky because she was married to Dr. E.W. Rucker of Birmingham, and that's how she got the nickname. Then next is Emily Hill Lastly, my father's twin sister. And on the far right is L.L. Luther Lyons Hill. This is virtually the same picture except that their mammy is in it with them. Starting from the left is my father Lister Hill, next to him his sister Lillian Hill Rucker, then the baby of the family, L.L. Hill, and mammy, and the far right, Emily Hill Lastly. This is Dr. L.L. Hill's home at 422 South Perry Street, where my father and his sister Emily and the other children grew up. This is a photograph of my grandmother, whom I call Nana, Lily Lyons Hill. She's sitting on the front porch of the house on South Perry Street. Oh, this is a picture of my father on the left with his hair parted down the middle and the dog Sport sitting next to his brother LL. This is a picture of my grandmother, Lily Lyons Hill, on the house at on South Perry Street, and the picture was taken around Christmas during World War I. Note the wreath and Red Cross flag. This is a family photograph of some of the Hill family. On the far left is who I was taught to call Aunt Carr, but she was my great aunt. She was married to William Wallace Hill. Next to her is Emily Lastly, then my grandmother, Lillian Hill, then my grandfather, Dr. Hill, and then at the far right, Lillian Hill Rucker. This is a picture of my father, Mr. Hill, with his brother, L.L. Hill, while at the University of Alabama. L.L. was an excellent student and a Phi Beta Kappa who graduated at 16. Joseph Luster was a student politician and was elected president of the student body which he helped to form. He was the first president of the Student Government Association, the SGA, at the University of Alabama, and he was the one that got the Student Government Association started in 1915. My father also was Phi Beta Kappa. This is a photograph of my Uncle L.L., my father's brother, when he went to West Point. As mentioned before, he was a general in World War II. This is a photograph of my Aunt Emily Hill Lastly, my father's twin. During World War I, she did her share for the American Red Cross, not only then, but also during World War II. This is my grandmother, Nana as I called her, Lily Hill, with her first grandchild, the young L.L. Hill. This is another picture of my grandfather, Dr. Luther Leanders Hill. This is a family portrait taken at an anniversary celebration of my grandparents. This is a photograph of my grandmother, Lillian Lyons Hill, when she was a young girl. This is a picture of a portrait of my grandmother, Lily Lyons Hill, about the time she met my grandfather, Dr. L.L. Hill. Many years later, a painting was made from a picture. When she saw it, Lily said, "I never was that beautiful, but don't change a thing." This is a picture of Laura Croom Hill, the second wife of the Reverend William Wallace Hill, and the mother of my grandfather and the rest of his siblings, with the exception of the half-brother Walter. This is a photograph of a picture of my mother because there was a review in the newspaper by Esther Mahoney, who was the editor of the social page, and she is writing about the book my mother wrote on her family and her genealogy, which she entitled The Family Skeleton. And I plan to title this production Family Skeleton Part 2. It's up to somebody else, my descendants, to create Part 3. This is a photograph of my grandmother, Henrietta Fontaine Copeland McCormick Dent. Her first husband died. That's why she ended up with so many names. And she has got both of her children in her arms. On the right is my mother, Henrietta Fontaine, and on the left is my mother's sister, my Aunt Mary Fluellen Andrews. This is a photograph of my grandfather, William Love McCormick, who I never knew because he died before I was born. He had typhoid fever, and they gave him a big dose of laxative, and he dehydrated, and he died at a young age, so I never knew him. He was married to my grandmother, my mother. He was the grandfather, my maternal grandfather. This is a photograph of my grandmother, Mama Etta, on her wedding day, and she is in my mother's book, The Family Skeleton, right next to her husband, my grandfather, who I never knew. And my mother wrote a little poem about her mother and father, and I'd like to read it to you. Mama was spirit, Papa was conscious. Mama was inspiration, Papa was reality. Mama built you up and made you feel that nothing was beyond your reach. Papa confronted you with the bare facts of life. Papa was the rainy days without which the earth could not flourish. Mama was warmth and sunshine. Papa was the salt of the earth. Mama was life eternal. Both my mother and her mother, my grandmother, Mama Etta, loved to write poetry. Unfortunately, I did not inherit their talent. This is Catherine Love Allen, the Scottish lassie, who married George Chalmers McCormick. This is a picture of Annie Stewart McCormick, daughter of Catherine and George McCormick. This is a photograph of Colonel James T. Fluellen. In our family archives, we have the paper where President Andrew Johnson pardoned Colonel James Fluellen from fighting on the rebel side during the war between the states, as we say in the South. This is Henrietta Hargraves Fontaine, the first wife of James T. Fluellen. She is the Henrietta Fontaine whose portrait is in my possession and is handed down from generation to generation to any child in line who is named Henrietta Fontaine. I'm hoping for great-grandchildren that are going to be named that. I've had a promise from one grandson, but of course he may not have a girl, so we'll wait and see what happens to Henrietta Fontaine. This is a photograph of Mary Fluellen Copeland, who was my great-grandmother. And I have in my possession what was known as a writing desk that they would take with them when they went to visit plantations on the weekend. It contained their stationery and I assume some ink and a pen and a writing surface when you open up the box. It's a beautiful box. She was married to my great-grandfather. This is my great-grandfather, Dr. William Preston Copeland, who was still alive when I was born but died when I was just a baby. And he was married to Mary Fontaine Fluellen. As I said, I don't remember my great-grandfather, but my mother was pregnant with me, and 2 weeks before I was to be born, her water broke. So my paternal grandfather, Dr. L.L. Hill, was going to deliver me, and he refused to do so when the water broke because he was afraid I'd be too immature and wouldn't live. So my mother had a dry birth, which was very painful and took a long time. Her mother, my mametta, was here with her, and she said to Dr. Hill, if you don't take that baby, I'm calling my father, Dr. Copeland. Well, he still wouldn't do it and still wouldn't use forceps. And finally, they heard the whistle on the train blow. And my grandmother said, here comes Papa now. And my grandfather Hill said, I'm going to take this baby. And he took forceps and delivered me. And he named me on the spot after my mother because he said my mother had been so brave. And that's how I got the name Henrietta. These are 3 of the Copeland sisters. There was a 4th one, but she died at an early age. On the left is my grandmother, Henrietta, my mother, then Aunt Carol, Caroline Clayton, and Aunt Willie. This is a photograph of Governor John Adam Truton, first provincial governor of Georgia, a revolutionary patriot who was brutally murdered by the British. And it's through him and the position he held that I was able to become a member of the Colonial Dames of America. Truetlen. If any of my female descendants are interested in joining the Colonial Dames, this is the way they can get in, is through Governor Truton. They have to be directly descendant from me or from my brother's children. This is a photograph of a portrait of the Reverend Francis Fontaine, the French Huguenot minister from whom we are descended and came to America in 1720, settling in Virginia. He was the brother of Jean de La Fontaine, who wrote Fontaine's Fables, which is very much like our Aesop's fables that I grew up reading. This is a picture of John Maury Fontaine, descendant of Francis Fontaine. He was the first mayor of Columbus, Georgia, and he was an empire builder, and he helped to lay out the city of Columbus. and that is where my mother's family came from, was from Columbus. This is a picture of what's known as the Fontaine House. It's the one that was built by John Morris Fontaine on the banks of the Chattahoochee River in Columbus, Georgia. It is also where my mother and father were married, in that house. My father didn't want a lot of publicity. He was in Congress, and so he thought, well, we just ought to sneak away to Columbus. Prior to his marriage, the leader or conductor of the Army band approached him and said, "Your Honor, I am a non-commissioned officer, and everybody in the band is a commissioned officer, and I have no control over them. Can you help me?" And my father said yes, and he got a bill passed through Congress that whoever the conductor of any military band was, they would automatically have the designation as captain. And so the man was so grateful, he said, "Well, Mr. Hill, when you get married, I'm going to play at your wedding." Well, it just so happens on the day that Mother and Daddy were getting married, it appeared announced in the Columbus paper that they were getting married. And this particular band leader, this captain, was at Fort Benning nearby, and he actually appeared at the house and played at my Mother and Daddy's wedding, like he promised to do. And she had ordered a fancy spun sugar, do you know what that is? Cake. Well, you know, when you go to the circus and get that
Cotton candy?
cotton candy, it's firmer than that, but it's the same principle of putting a lot of air in it. And it arrived in 1,000 pieces. So she went to the bakery and got just a white small cake, and she took a wash pan to put as the bottom layer of the cake and just iced all around the wash pan and put the little white cake on top, and that was their wedding cake. Necessity is the mother of invention. This is a photograph of Charles and me on our honeymoon at Sea Island, Georgia in 1950. We were married November the 25th, 1950. This is a photograph of Charles with our firstborn child, Charles Clark Hubbard Jr., better known as Clark, who is an Episcopal minister and has a church outside of Savannah, Georgia. Born February the 12th, 1952. This is a photograph of Joseph Lister Hubbard, our youngest child. This is a picture of Charles, my husband, playing with our two sons, Clark and Lister. This is another picture of Lister and Clark. This is a photograph of Clark with his cousin Tom Ely and another friend. This is a photograph of Lister. I think he's just opened a Christmas present or a birthday present. This is a picture of Clark and Lister, and I think it's down in Destin, Florida. This is a picture of Lister as a little boy. He and Clark loved to go fishing with their daddy, and that might have been the first fish he ever caught because it's on camera. And it looks like it was at a pond. At various times we fished at various ponds. Charles belonged to them. This is a photograph of Lister as a little boy, dressed up in the Christmas vest I made for both children. This is a picture of me with Lister. This is another picture of the two boys. Oh, this is when Clark was a page. I believe it was for the Phantom Host Ball. This is a picture of Lister when he attended Camp Laney. He has on the jacket with the Camp Laney. This is a photograph of Clark Hubbard with a fish that he caught. This is a photograph of Lister, obviously trying to sneak out of the house. This is a picture that we took in Destin, Florida, where we went deep sea fishing with Clark and Lister holding up their catch. This is a photograph of Clark and Lister playing on their swing set in the backyard. That is a picture of Lister when he grew a mustache. That is Lister's wife, Sally Milligan Hubbard, who died very tragically at the age of 45 from a defective aorta. This is a photograph of Charles and myself with Lister and Clark. This is a photograph of Charles as a little boy on the left and his sister Ann on the right, outside of their home on Maston Lane. In the foreground is Charles Hubbard as a young boy playing with some of his friends in the yard. All right, this is dated April 1927, so Charles is the little boy in the foreground, would be 4 years old, and that's his older brother, Brannon, behind him. They are playing in the backyard of the house that they grew up in on Maston Lane, the house that Dr. and Ms. Hubbard built. This Charles is a baby sitting in his buggy. He was born in 1924. This is a photograph of me with Clark to your right and Lister to your left, and I'm holding the cat Missy, who's a Siamese cat, and that's Ralph, Charles's favorite dog, at my feet. This is a photograph of my mother as a young woman. That is a photograph of me in my hat that I had to wear. I wonder if that wasn't taken when Mother christened the USS Alabama in Norfolk, Virginia. It looks like what I had on at the time. This is a picture of me at Sweetbriar College. I was in the May Court when they had the May Day Queen. This is a picture of my mother and me in front of our house at 3715 49th Street, Washington, D.C. This is a picture of me at Sweetbriar College. This is a photograph of my father and my mother holding Clark after his baptism at the Church of the Ascension, which would have been about May 1952. This is a picture of my father with Clark and Lister. This is a picture of my mother. This is Charles and Clark and Lister at the beach. This is a photograph taken at the Silver Beach Hotel in Destin, Florida, of my mother and father and my brother Lister and his wife Catherine standing in the back. This is a photograph of my father, myself, and Lister when he graduated from Indian Springs School in Birmingham, Alabama. This is a picture of Charles's mother, Carolyn Hubbard, Carolyn Clark Hubbard, with her eldest son, who was a baby at the time, Brannon Hubbard Jr. You may note that I said her middle name is Clark. Her father started Kimberly Clark Company in Neenah, Wisconsin. This is a photograph of Dr. T. Brannon Hubbard with his eldest son, Brannon Jr., and you notice he's in uniform, so that was during World War I. This is a photograph of Charles's mother, Carolyn Clark Hubbard. This is a photograph of Charles's father, Dr. T. Brannon Hubbard, in his older age. Oh, that's a photograph of Charles and me on some cruise. I can't say which one. We went to several Caribbean cruises. That's a picture of Charles that he gave me when we were dating before we were married. Those are our sons fishing. This is a photograph of my mother as a little girl. This is a photograph of my mother and father at our son Lister Hubbard's marriage to Sally Milligan Hubbard. This is a photograph of my grandfather, Dr. Luther Leanders Hill, about the age he was in college, medical school, and then going to study with Lord Joseph Lister in England. This is a photograph from a newspaper article. Charles and I are seated in the front. On the right, far right in the back, is our son Clark Hubbard and his first wife, Kate Faulkner Hubbard. Then Sally Hubbard, who's the wife of Lister Hubbard, on the far left. This is a photograph of Sally Hubbard, Lister's wife. This is a photograph of my grandmother, my mother's, her backyard. And that stone bench there, she gave me one, and our son Lister still has the one that I gave him that came from her. In the foreground, where you can't see, she had a little fish pond, and the big deal was every morning we'd go out and feed the fish. Her father was Dr. William Preston Copeland, and he was a physician, and he did surgery and everything as people did in those days. And he had an examining table where the head and the feet would go down. And of course, when he died, my grandmother inherited his office, and she took that examining table and dug 4 holes in the ground to sink the feet down so it would be of the normal height to be a chaise long. And that stayed in her backyard.
That backyard?
That backyard, right there. This is the back of the house that Charles grew up in on Maston Lane. That was a big screen porch that went all the way across the back of the house. This is the picture of Eleanor and Carolyn, Clark's 2 daughters, who were in the wedding of our niece, Anne Ely, Jr. This is a picture of us cutting the cake at the reception, which was held at the Blue Moon Inn in Montgomery. That's my mother next to Charles, and I don't know the gentleman on the right. That's a picture of me feeding Charles a piece of wedding cake. That's a photograph of Charles with our grandson, Brownon Hubbard, who is Lister's child. That's another photograph of Charles and me on a cruise. This is a photograph of my great-grandfather, Dr. William Preston Copeland. Starting from the back left, that's a photograph of Charles's father, Dr. T. Brownon Hubbard, who was in World War I. To his left, your right, is his mother, Augusta Brownon Hubbard. Seated, holding the baby, is Florida Copeland, and she was the sister of my great-grandfather, Dr. William Preston Copeland, who, if we haven't gotten to him yet, you will see. So Charles and I are actually cousins. And I was brought up calling her Aunt Florida, because that's what my mother called her. And sitting in Aunt Florida's lap is Charles's eldest brother, T. Brownon Hubbard, Jr. This is a photograph of my mother with one of my children. This is a photograph of Lister and Clark.
That's your dad.
And my father, Lister Hill. This is a photograph of my mother on the left and her sister, my Aunt Mary, on the right, taken when they were children. This is a photograph of a young William Preston Copeland, my great-grandfather. This is a photograph of Dr. William Preston Copeland, father of Henrietta Fontaine Copeland, who was the mother of Henrietta Fontaine McCormick, who was the mother of Henrietta Fontaine Hill, who is the mother of Charles Clark Hubbard, Jr., and Joseph Lister Hill Hubbard. This is a photograph of our son Clark's eldest daughter, Eleanor, the day she was married to her husband, Tom Montgomery. They live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This is a photograph of Mary Copeland, the daughter of Dr. William Preston Copeland, who married William Love McCormick and was the mother of my grandmother, my mother. This is a photograph of our son Clark Hubbard with his daughter Carolyn Hubbard, and it was taken at the marriage of Clark's daughter Eleanor. This is a photograph of taken at Eleanor Hubbard's wedding. On the far right is Emily Hubbard. Next to her is Clark Hubbard, then Eleanor, then her husband Tom Montgomery, myself, my husband Charles kind of in the back, and Carolyn, her sister, in the front. This is a picture of Clark dancing with his daughter Eleanor. This is Eleanor and her sister Carolyn. That's a photograph of my mother. Ooh. This is a photograph of when Mrs. Roosevelt came through Montgomery on her way to Tuskegee and had lunch at our house that day. She is seated with the big hat. Next to her is my brother Lister, and then next to him am I. Behind us stands my father and my mother. That is a photograph of my mother, my grandmother, with Clark, her great-grandson. This is a photograph of my step-grandfather, Captain Henry A. Dent, my grandmother, and my Aunt Mary, my mother's sister. The grandmother is my mother, and that's in the parlor of her house on Randolph Street, in front of the portrait of the original Henrietta Fontaine. This is a photograph of Charles's grandfather, Charles Benjamin Clark, who was co-founder of Kimberly-Clark in Neenah, Wisconsin. He fought in the Civil War on the Yankee side, as we would say. He was part of an infantry division from Wisconsin. He lived in Neenah, Wisconsin. This is a photograph of Charles's mother as a young woman. She was Carolyn Clark Hubbard. This is a photograph of my father, Senator Lister Hill, sitting in his favorite wing chair in his den at his house at 1618 Gilmer Avenue, Montgomery, Alabama. This is my favorite photograph of him during his later years because it looks so animated and so much like him, has his spirit in it. This is a photograph of my father during World War I. He was a captain in the infantry. This is a photograph of Charles's grandparents. Charles, this is your family. Why don't you tell us who they are, starting from the left?
On the left is Augusta Brannan Hubbard. Standing behind her is young Thomas Brannan Hubbard. Sitting next to her is Margaret Hubbard. Next to Margaret is William Hubbard, my grandfather, and on his left is Lewis Hubbard, my uncle. This is my grandmother and grandfather with their 3 children.
Standing behind them on the left part of the picture is Thomas Brannan Hubbard, Charles Hubbard's father. This is a photograph of Charles's brother, Brannan Hubbard, as a little baby, and the dog is named Raffles, and their mammy was named Mary German, and she stayed with the family for many years. This is my father, Lister Hill. That's my grandmother with my mother and her sister, my Aunt Mary. This is a photograph of Charles and me. It may have been the first date we had going to a dance. That is a photograph of our son Lister and his daughter Jean Catherine. This is the photograph of Richard Folsom, who worked for us for many years, and for a lot of my friends also. He started out working in the yard, but he could serve a party, and he could cook, he could do lots of things. And so on his 80th birthday, we had a tea party for him. That is a photograph of Clark in his vestments. This is Clark and his daughter Eleanor on her wedding day. This is a photograph of my grandmother, my mother, as a bride. This is a photograph of our grandson, Joseph Lister Hubbard, and his wife, Ashley. That's a photograph of my granddaughter, Jean Catherine, on the left, and a good friend of hers on the right. This is another photograph of Jean Catherine. As you can tell, she was an angel in the Christmas pageant. This is a photograph of my mother holding me as a baby at her mother's house, my mama's, in Eufaula, Alabama. This is a photograph of my mother standing behind a tree in her mother's yard in Eufaula, Alabama. That's Clark's youngest daughter, Carolyn Hubbard. This is a photograph of my mother and me carrying luggage. It was in the newspaper, and a story about me going off to Sweetbriar College. That is a photograph that was also in the newspaper of me with Clark and Lister, Lister being the smaller one. That is a photograph of Clark doing his first baptism as an ordained minister. This is a photograph of Clark in the back. On his right is Eleanor, his daughter. Seated below on the left is Emily Hubbard with her grandchild, and next to the child is Carolyn Hubbard, Clark's youngest daughter. This is a photograph that appeared in the paper, and I did not have a copy myself, of my grandmother's house in Eufaula. This is the house. She didn't have much money, and she was a poor widow, so she managed to get a coat of paint on one side each year. This is a picture of my 50th birthday. You may be able to make out there's a 50 on that cake. On the far right is my husband Charles, seated. I'm seated. On the far left is our granddaughter Eleanor. Behind Eleanor is Ashley, and next to Ashley is Joe Hubbard, and next to Joe is Charlie Hubbard, and right behind me is Gene Hubbard. That's Clark and his second wife, Emily. This is a photograph of my granddaughter, who's very pregnant, and her husband, Tom Montgomery. They live in Tuscaloosa. She's expecting a baby in March 2007. This is a photograph of Mamie German, who you've met before, was a mammy for the Hubbard family. She's holding Charles, and standing next to them is Charles' sister Ann, known as Diddy, D-I-D-D-Y. This is a photograph of my mother holding me as a young baby. This is a photograph of my mother holding me as a little older baby. This is a photograph of Charles's father, Dr. T. Brown Hubbard. This is a photograph of my grandmother, who I call Nana, Lillian Lyons Hill, holding me, and next to her is seated my father, Lister Hill. This is a photograph of my grandmother, Mametta, and her father, my great-grandfather, Dr. William Preston Copeland. This is a photograph of my great-grandfather, who I never knew because he died not too long after this, holding me. He didn't die holding me, he died. Let me start over.
I think we ought to leave it like that.
He died of. Oh, I'm getting punchy now, Bill. This is a photograph of Dr. William Preston Copeland, my great-grandfather. He didn't live too long after I was born, but this is a picture of him holding me. This is a photograph of me and my first cousin, called Sonny Comer. His real name was Jim Comer, Jr. He used to babysit me and come and stay with Mother when Daddy was out on the road campaigning. When he was about 15 years old, he went to a dance, and he was not old enough to drive. And on the way home from the dance, a drunken man ran into the car and killed him. Unbeknownst to my mother, she was at home. This was shortly before Christmas, and she was writing Christmas cards to her friends and relatives. And she suddenly started crying, and I said, "Mother, why are you crying?" She said, "I don't know, but something terrible has happened to somebody in the family." And it was true. Sonny died that night. This is a photograph of my Aunt Mary, my mother's sister, holding me in front of the house in Eufaula, Alabama. This is a photograph of my father holding me, and it looks like it's in back of my grandparent Hill's house. I think this is a photograph of my grandmother Nana, Lillian Hill, when she was a girl. This is a photograph of Charles as a baby being held by Mamie German, the nurse, and the boy standing on the left is his brother Brannon, and the little girl on the right is his sister Ann. That's a picture of my mother, Henrietta Fontaine McCormick. I wondered if it wasn't her engagement picture. I think it was taken not too long before she was married. When I was growing up, it was not always easy being the daughter of a well-known person. There were certain advantages. I got to go to the Easter egg roll on the White House lawn, where I promptly got lost, but they took me to the Red Cross tent and found my mother. I was also able to attend 2 of Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration. His 4th one, illegally, you were supposed to be 18, and I was 15, but Daddy got me in and we stood in the snow. It was done at the White House for the first time because of the snow and because of his disability getting to the Capitol. But there were also downsides to being a famous person's daughter. I never let my classmates in high school know what my father did. I said he worked for the government. One experience that I had that really annoyed me, when I married Charles and moved to Montgomery, I went into a store and there were lots of clerks standing around talking to each other, and no one would pay any attention to me. And finally this clerk came rushing up, oh, Miss Hubbard, come in, I'm so glad to see you. And I said, thank you very much, but I have to go. I was annoyed that she would only wait on me because I was somebody's daughter, and not just because I walked in off the street as anybody else in the world would do. So there were ups and downs to that, and it was very difficult to try to establish yourself as yourself and not be so-and-so's daughter. This is file 2233. It's a picture of my mother holding our son, Clark Hubbard. File 2234 is a picture of Charles holding Clark shortly after he was born. File 2235 is a photograph of Clark on the right and Lister on the left. This is a photograph of Charles holding Clark. He just had a bath. This is a photograph. On the right is my mother, in the middle is Clark, and on the left is a picture of me. This is a photograph of Clark playing with the hose in the front yard. This is a photograph of Charles playing with Clark on the sofa. This is a photograph of me and Clark. This is a photograph of my mother trying to kiss Clark as a little baby. This is a photograph of Charles standing in the middle with Lister to his left, and next to Lister, Clark, and on the far left is a friend of theirs. This is a photograph on the far right of Clark, Charles in the middle, and me on the left. This is a photograph of me kissing Clark after his marriage. This is Clark holding his firstborn child, Eleanor. This is a photograph of me holding Clark and our dog, Sheila. This is a photograph of Charles giving Clark his bottle. This is a photograph of Charles and me, and it may even be before we were married or right after we were married. This was in the living room on the sofa in his parents' house on Maston Lane. This is a photograph of my mother as a young lady. This is a photograph of me as a little girl, probably about 2.5 or 3 years old. This is a photograph of the 3 Henriettas on the far left in the back. I'm seated. On the far right in the back, my mother is seated. And in the middle is my grandmother, my mother, and she's holding Clark right after he was born. This photograph was taken on the screen porch of the first house we lived in. To the far left is Lister. Then is my father, Lister Hill. Next to him is Clark, and next to Clark is my mother, Henrietta Hill. This is a photograph of my mother with Clark. This is a photograph of Charles's father, Dr. Thomas Brannan Hubbard, and my mother, Henrietta Hill. This is a photograph in the back of Charles's family residence. To the far left is his older brother, who was known as Bo Hubbard, but his real name was Thomas Brannan Hubbard. And in the middle is Charles, and next to him is his sister, Ann Hubbard. This is a photograph of Ann on the left, and Charles is a little boy on the right. Anne is Charles's older sister. This is a photograph of Charles in his buggy. This is a photograph of Charles as a young boy. This is a photograph of Charles, obviously taken in Destin, Florida. This is a photograph of Charles as a grown man. This is a photograph of Charles's father, Dr. T.B. Hubbard. You see why we said debonair and bon vivant. Look at the handkerchief. This is a photograph of Charles's mother, Carolyn, who we all call Callie, and Clark in her lap, and Charles's father, Doc, which is what we call Dr. Hubbard. This is a photograph of Charles's father, Dr. Hubbard. This is a photograph of Charles's mother holding Clark as a baby. This is a photograph of the front door in Charles's home at the end of Maston Lane. The home is no longer in existence. This is the back of the house on Maston Lane where Charles grew up. This is a photograph of Hubbard Hospital that Dr. Hubbard built. This is a photograph that was taken when Mrs. Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's wife, was on her way to Tuskegee, and she came and had lunch with us. She is seated. Behind her is my mother standing and my father standing. In front, the little boy is my younger brother, Lister Hill, and I am seated next to him. This is a photograph of Charles on the far right, Paula Grand next to him, and I don't know the other two young men that was taken at Washington Lee University after the World War II. This is a not too long ago family picture taken. To the far right is Joe Hubbard, our grandson, and his wife Ashley. Then there's Charles and me, and standing in front of me is Jean Catherine Hubbard, that's Lister's daughter. Next to Jean is Charlie Hubbard. Behind Charlie is Lister Hubbard, our son. Next to him is Eleanor Hubbard Montgomery and her husband, Tom Montgomery.